This video will show you how to replace your front sealed wheel bearing on this Subaru Outback. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. We'll remove all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. If you have a locking lug nut, you're going to want to make sure you have that key. Since mine does have the locking lug nuts, I'm going to be using that first. We'll just turn this until it feels like it wants to seat. Once it does, go ahead and turn that counterclockwise to remove it. We'll be using a 34mm to remove our axle nut. We'll use a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle to break it free from our wheel bearing. Once you do have movement from that, we can continue on. Now, as far as this tie rod and nut is concerned, typically you're going to find that it's a castle nut and it has a cotter pin holding it in place. You're going to need to remove that cotter pin before you can remove the mounting nut. I'm just going to use some cutters. Let's get this out of here. You can see an ear of that right up along the top on my application. This can be pretty much anywhere. It really depends on where somebody set it. Now my cotter pin is rusted in place. This is extremely common. If that is the case, we're just going to cut the cotter pin and then we'll continue on with that mounting nut. We'll use our 19mm for that mounting nut. Once you have that off of there, just a quick inspection, and we're going to start it back on a couple threads. Now continuing on, we need to separate the outer tie rod end from our steering knuckle. To do this, we're going to cause vibration, and that should break this free. Once it does, it's going to drop down, and that mounting nut will prevent it from falling down and potentially hurting us. We'll hold that outer tie rod end, remove that mounting nut, separate the tie rod from the knuckle. Now, if your cotter pin was lodged in there, you're going to want to remove it. You can do that using a drill bit or even a small hammer and a punch. I'm replacing this outer tie rod end, so I don't have to worry about that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start dislodging our brakes. We're going to be doing that by removing the caliper. Before we do so, let's use our original axle nut and one of our lug nuts. I'm going to put this in place so it holds the rotor for us so it does not fall off while we continue on with the removal process of the caliper itself. Prior to removing the caliper, we want to try to push in our 2 caliper pistons. We don't need to go too far, we just want to have a little bit of movement, moving those pads away from our brake rotor. So I'm going to make my way in between this area. I'm prying the caliper away from my brake rotor. I just need a tiny gap. Now that I have movement from there, we're continuing on along the back side of this. Now we're moving towards our caliper bracket mounting bolts. Remove the first mounting bolt, a quick inspection, and then start it back in a couple threads. That's going to hold the caliper in place while we continue on to the final mounting bolt. Let's hold on to the caliper while we remove this mounting bolt. A quick note about this is when you do remove it, we do not want to put any pressure on our brake flex hose. It's a good idea to have some sort of hanging system to rest the caliper on. Now that we have the caliper off of there, just a quick inspection of the brake pads to confirm they're not worn or damaged in any way. We'll set this aside. Now let's just take hold of that brake rotor, making sure that it cannot fall off of the vehicle. We'll remove the hardware holding it in place and remove the brake rotor. A quick inspection of that, we can set it aside. Now that we have the brake rotor out of the way, we have a clear view of our front sealed wheel bearing. We can see the threaded portion of our mounting hardware. The hardware comes through from the rear of the steering knuckle into the wheel bearing. Now we'll be using a 14mm for each of our 4 bolts from the backside here. I'm using a swivel socket. Now we're on to the forward side, same process, 2 14mm bolts. Now at this point, I always like to start my axle nut on just a couple threads. It's clearly still loose. We can move the axle around. We'll use some penetrant along the areas where the wheel bearing connects to the steering knuckle. Allow that to do its job, and we'll continue on separating this. We'll continue on with a hammer. There's also bearing removal tools that you can use if you have one of those tools. Otherwise, by using a hammer, we're going to cause vibration. I'm attempting to drive it down a little bit, breaking it free here. I'll make my way up, wiggling this back and forth. Once it's loose enough, we should be able to pull this out of place. Now, if you found that the hammer did not break this free, which is extremely common, you're going to have a wheel bearing removal tool. These come in all different shapes and sizes, different designs even. For the one I have it on the wheel hub, it's held in place, and I'm going to have the driver making its way over towards that steering knuckle. Now on this application, I really don't have too many areas that I can press up against, so I'm just going against the bolt head here. I don't want to cause any damage. We just want to attempt to start flexing this wheel bearing out and away from the steering knuckle. Now that I do have a slight gap, I'm continuing on with some more penetrant. We can see we have a fairly large gap up along the top. Now let's attempt to make our way down along the bottom to rock this out of position. I'm going to loosen the tool, we'll swing this down, and we're aiming for this area. Let's remove the tool, and we can continue on with a hammer as necessary. Now that I have that broken free, I can remove my axle nut and remove the wheel bearing. There it is, friend. Now that we have the original wheel bearing out of the steering knuckle, the next thing we have to do is clean and inspect the mounting surface. We're going to clean and inspect along this outer base. We'll make our way inside of this port. One note about this is you will have an ABS wheel speed sensor protruding through, so you just want to be careful not to damage that in any way. Other than that, obviously inspect your axle shaft as well. I'm just going to use a wire brush. Okay, we've used our brush. Now let's use some parts cleaner. A quick wipe with a clean rag. Once you've confirmed there's no raised areas that you need to deal with, we'll continue on with some anti-seize. As far as the anti-seize, we want to make our way inside of the circular port. We'll also make our way along the outside of the port as well. After we've completed both of those areas, just a little bit on the splined area of the axle, but not necessarily on the threaded portion. If you did get a little bit on that threaded portion, that's okay. Just go ahead and clean it down. We don't need it there. Moving along, you want to also make sure you clean and inspect your mounting bolts. Once you have those cleaned, I always like to use some blue thread locker. And now it's time for installation of our brand new front wheel bearing. The first thing I like to do on this is just take a look along the backside. Look at those bolt holes. Up along the top, the 2 upper mounting bolt holes should be closer than the 2 lower mounting bolt holes. You can go ahead and match that up to the vehicle itself. Slide it into position and align your mounting bolt holes so we can insert each one of the mounting bolts from along the back side of the steering knuckle. Slide this onto the axle. Align everything as necessary. Now, we don't generally have to press this in all the way. It's going to be a tight fit. We want to make sure those bolts actually align before we continue on fully pressing it in. Start getting those bolts in there. For each of these bolts, we want to start them all in before we tighten any of them. As I mentioned, you may have to make an adjustment of that wheel bearing to get each one of these bolts started in. Generally, once you have the first 1 or even 2 in place, the other 2 should align as well. They're all started in. Let's go ahead and snug them up. Just make sure these are snug over here. Same on the other side. And we'll torque all of our mounting bolts to 48 foot-pounds. Let's go over the other side. Now, just like the other side, we're torquing these bolts to 48 foot-pounds as well. Now, along the outboard side of the wheel bearing, on the hub flange, let's apply some anti-seize along the areas that's going to touch up against our brake rotor. Let's go ahead and spread this around. You don't need very much. Just a thin layer should do. Now the next thing we want to do is clean and inspect the mounting surface on the back side of our brake rotor, right in the center here. Confirm there's no miscellaneous debris or raised areas. These can cause a brake pulsation. Let's get that brake rotor in place. We're going to hold it in place, once again with our axle nut and one of our lug nuts. Now once you have that in place, we'll be continuing on with our caliper next. We're moving along to the caliper. Take that caliper and we're going to slide it over our rotor. Start in each one of your 2 mounting bolts. I'm using blue thread locker. Now once you have both of those started in, you're going to snug them up and torque them to 89 foot-pounds. We'll just double check to make sure our flex hose is not twisted in any way that will cause a brake fluid restriction and a brake pull. Let's move along to our outer tie rod end. Now we can start installing the outer tie rod end into the steering knuckle. As we bring this up, we're going to want to make sure we install our mounting nut along the top. Now since I'm replacing my outer tie rod end, my mounting nut actually has a neoprene locker in there. This isn't a castle nut like we originally had. If you're using your original outer tie rod end, you want to make sure you tighten and torque it properly. Once it's torqued, we need to make sure that we have the port on the tie rod end aligned with the slots on the castle nut. If it's not lined up, continue tightening till the very next slot is, and then install your cotter pin. Let's get this tie rod end in place. We're bringing it up to the steering knuckle. Now we'll continue on with our mounting nut. I have a neoprene locking nut, so I do not have a cotter pin that I need to contend with. We're going to snug this up and torque it to 20 foot-pounds. If you find when you attempt to tighten the tie rod end nut, it wants to spin on you, go ahead and carefully use a pry bar underneath your outer tie rod end. We're prying up against our lower control arm, applying upward pressure. Snug that nut. Let's get this off of here. Now we can install our axle nut. When installing the axle nut, you never want to use an impact tool. If you over-tighten this, you will cause damage to your bearing and possibly the axle. For this, you just want to use a hand ratchet or hand tool of some sort, and we'll go ahead and snug it up. Once you do have it snug, we'll get this closer to the ground so we can torque it to the proper torque specification. Now we have this in an area that we can start torquing it. To torque this, you can either have a second person inside of the vehicle pressing on the brake pedal, or you can have a pry bar like I have here. We're going to go diagonally across these studs all the way down to the ground. That's going to prevent this from turning on us while we continue on torquing this to 162 foot-pounds. Once you do have that torqued, go ahead and remove the bar. Now we're going to pay attention to our axle nut and the axle itself. Look at the axle. You can see that there's a rectangular slot. We're going to be using a hammer and punch to try to drive part of this nut down into that groove. That will prevent this from loosening up on us while we're driving down the road. Once you're confident that it's locked down, we'll continue on with our wheel. One last inspection in this area and we can reinstall our wheel. Once you have that in place, you're going to continue on with all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. If you do have a locking lug nut, you want to use that as well. We'll start them on, snug them up. Get the wheel back on the ground, and the torque for each of these will be 90 foot-pounds. Now we have the wheel back on the ground, so we're going to torque these to that 90 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. The next thing you need to do is hop in the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm, take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.